Have you ever stared at a complex framework, maybe for managing technology across an entire organization, and just felt that wave of information wash over you?
Oh, yeah,
All the diagrams, the numbers, the acronyms. It's a lot.
definitely.
Where do you even begin to find the parts that really matter?
It's that moment, isn't it, where you know the information you need is in there, but accessing it, understanding it, connecting the pieces,
Mhm.
it feels like trying to drink from a fire hose.
Exactly.
It's easy to get overwhelmed by the sheer volume and, the structure of it all.
And that's exactly the problem. The deep dive is here to help you solve. We take the sources you've gathered, your articles, your research, those dense framework documents, and we dive deep into them.
Right.
We wrestle with the text, we connect the concepts, and we extract those crucial nuggets of knowledge, those perhaps surprising insights, and present them in a way that helps you get genuinely informed fast.
We're sort of your guides for this journey into your source material, helping you navigate the landscape and highlight what's most important to understand within it.
Okay, so today we're taking on a significant one. We're performing a deep dive into the COBIT 2019 framework,
Yep.
specifically focusing on some fundamental governance and management objectives found within the Align, Plan, and Organize domain, APO.
That's right. Using only the COBIT 2019 framework document you shared as our source, our mission today is to unpack three specific foundational objectives within that APO domain, APO 1, APO 02, and APO 03.
Right.
We're going to walk you through what the framework says about these, kind of like instructors guiding you through key concepts, helping you grasp their essence, and how they, lay the groundwork for effectively managing INT.
All right, let's jump right in then. Before we even look at these specific APO objectives, the source material, it sets the stage really nicely, I think, by making a critical distinction up front.
Mm-hmm.
Governance versus management objectives. This seems core to how COBIT thinks about the world.
It absolutely is. According to the framework source, governance is primarily the realm of the board of directors, or, the chairperson.
Yeah.
While they can delegate tasks, their fundamental role, captured in the Evaluate, Direct, and Monitor, or EDM domain, is about evaluating stakeholder needs, setting direction for management, and then monitoring performance and compliance.
So keeping an eye on things from the top.
Exactly. The source makes it pretty clear that ultimate accountability for governance typically rests with the board and executive management.
So governance is the big picture, the are we doing the right things and are we doing them well kind of oversight, evaluating the needs, directing the overall path, and keeping an eye on performance from the top.
Precisely. Then there's management. The source describes management as the responsibility of executive management, usually led by the CEO.
Right.
Management is about the doing. It involves planning, building, running, and monitoring activities. But crucially, this is done in alignment with the direction provided by governance to actually achieve the enterprise's objectives.
Okay, so management is kind of the engine room, the how do we achieve the things governance wants us to achieve.
Yep.
And the management domains listed are APO, Align, Plan, and Organize, which we're looking at, but also BAI, Build, Acquire, and Implement, DSS, Deliver, Service, and Support, and MEA, Monitor, Evaluate, and Assess.
Exactly. Those are where senior and middle management operate.
So governance sets the destination and checks the compass, that's EDM, while management figures out the route, builds the ship, sails it, and keeps the engine running. The APO, BAI, DSS, MEA bits.
That's a great way to put it. And the framework structure, as the source shows, ties each governance or management objective to a specific process, right? And that process is supported by a series of related components.
Right, components. And those components, what are they exactly? The source talks about things like organizational structures, information flows, policies, skills, culture. Basically, the things that make the process actually work.
Yeah, exactly. The components are like the building blocks or the necessary ingredients. A process doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It needs the right people, the right information, the right rules, and the right kind of environment to function properly.
Okay. And today, we're squarely in the management domain, specifically APO, Align, Plan, and Organize. What's the overarching purpose of this domain, based on what the source says?
Well, as the name suggests, the APO domain is fundamentally about making sure INT is aligned with the enterprise. It's about setting strategic direction and putting the necessary foundational elements in place so INT can contribute effectively.
So it's the planning and organizing layer that kind of comes before the building and running parts.
That's it. It lays the groundwork.
Now, the source mentions there are 40 objectives described in detail, and we're just focusing on 3 key ones from APO that, well, they often feel quite foundational. APO1, APO02, and APO03.
Yeah, they really do.
They seem to build on each other in a pretty logical way.
They absolutely do. They represent the critical first steps in creating a structured approach to INT management.
So let's start with the very first one, APO01. What is APO01 all about?
Okay. APO01. It's titled Managed INT Management Framework. At its heart, this objective is about establishing how the enterprise will manage its information and technology.
How, not what.
Exactly. It's about designing, implementing, and maintaining the overall system, the structure, the operating rules for INT management itself.
Ah, so it's not about what INT does specifically, but how the function of managing INT is organized and performed, like building the foundation and the walls for the entire INT house, maybe?
That's a good analogy. And the source breaks this down into several management practices that make up the process for APO01. Want to dive into some key ones?
Yeah, let's do it. What does the source highlight?
Okay. Well, one key practice is APO01.01, Design the Management System for Enterprise INT. This is really about figuring out the blueprint for the management system. Yeah. It takes inputs from the governance side, things like the enterprise's governance principles and its decision-making models, along with other things like emerging risks, and uses them to actually design how INT management will operate.
So you're using the overall business guidance to figure out how INT management should be structured. And the output is the design itself, right? Which includes prioritizing other governance and management objectives the enterprise will focus on.
Exactly. You need those high-level inputs to know what kind of management system you actually need. Another really important practice mentioned is APO 1.02, Communicate Management Objectives, Direction, and Decisions Made.
Communication. Yeah, that's often where things break down, isn't it?
Totally.
The source seems to emphasize that getting the decisions and the strategic direction understood throughout the organization is vital.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This practice takes inputs like those governance principles and maybe risk communications, and it produces the actual communication of objectives and directions. It's really about making sure everyone is on the same page regarding how INT is meant to operate and what it's aiming to achieve.
Sort of laying the groundwork for alignment.
Precisely. Then there's APO 1.04. Define and implement the organizational structures. The management framework isn't just abstract theory. It needs people and teams organized effectively.
Right. This is where the source talks about defining who is responsible for what parts of the INT management system. It mentions inputs like enterprise operational guidelines and those governance principles again. And the output is the actual definition of the organizational structure and functions. The source even details specific activities like aligning INT structures with enterprise architecture models and establishing concrete bodies like an INT steering committee.
That steering committee is a perfect example of a tangible structure defined by this practice. Usually composed of business and INT leadership to oversee status, resolve issues, monitor service levels, that kind of thing.
Okay. And building on structure, there's APO 1.05, establish roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, this goes deeper than just boxes on an org chart.
Right.
The source says this practice is about clearly defining and communicating the specific roles, responsibilities, and crucially, the authority levels for enterprise INT.
Authority levels. Okay.
It takes inputs like maybe skills matrices and development plans, and the outputs include detailed role definitions and who has what authority. The source specifically calls out the activity of clearly delineating responsibilities, especially for decision-making and approvals.
That seems critical for accountability. If you don't know who decides, things grind to a halt or go off track.
Exactly. And the source even provides example metrics for this, like counting how many roles have been assigned or how many role descriptions are actually complete. That gives you a way to measure if you're, actually doing this practice.
Huh. Practical. There's also practice about optimize the placement of the IT function, APO 1.06. Where does IT physically or organizationally sit within the larger enterprise?
Yeah, this practice considers the enterprise strategy and the operating model to figure out the best place for the IT function. It involves evaluating different options. It's really about making sure the organizational setup supports the business's needs effectively.
And what about data? That's huge these days. There's a practice, APO 1.07, define information, data, and system ownership.
Yes, absolutely critical. This practice, according to the source, is all about defining who is ultimately responsible, who owns key data assets and systems.
Ownership. Got it.
It takes inputs like data classification guidelines and produces outputs like data security and control guidelines, data integrity procedures. Establishing that clear ownership is just foundational for data governance.
You can see how that would be. Okay, another practice. APO 1.09, define and communicate policies and procedures. This sounds like where the rules of the road for the framework get formalized.
Exactly. This involves putting in place the procedures for compliance, for measuring performance, and for enforcement. The source highlights activities like regularly assessing the performance of the framework's components themselves.
So, checking if the framework itself is working.
Yeah. It even gives example metrics here like tracking when policies were last updated or counting, get this, INT-related loss exposures due to inadequacies in the framework.
Wow, that's a pretty direct measure of effectiveness or lack thereof.
It is. Finally, under the process practices for APO1, there's APO 1.11, define process capability levels. This sounds like measuring maturity, maybe? It is. This practice helps an organization assess how well it's actually performing its INT processes. It uses inputs like those enterprise governance principles, again, to define what different levels of capability look like.
Like CMMI levels, sort of.
Sort of, yeah. It's how you figure out if you're just, winging it, or if your processes are repeatable, managed, or even optimized.
Okay, so the process component for APO01 gives us the specific actions or practices to take to build this INT management framework. But the source also describes other components that support this objective, right? Like organizational structures.
Right. Beyond the practices themselves, the framework relies on having the necessary structures in place. The source provides guidance on relevant roles, referencing typical enterprise structures. It lists roles like the board, CEO, CIO, CTO, Chief Digital Officer, maybe an INT governance board, and that steering committee we mentioned.
And the source describes what each of these roles or bodies typically does.
Yeah, it gives typical responsibilities from the board's overall governance accountability to the CIO's seniority in INT. The governance board may be guiding specific INT matters, or the steering committee overseeing programs and projects.
But I imagine the names aren't set in stone.
Exactly. And that's really important, something the source explicitly states. Organizations must tailor this. The specific titles and structures will vary massively.
So the key is the function, not the label.
Precisely. The key is to ensure the necessary responsibilities and accountabilities are assigned somewhere, regardless of the specific name you use for the role or committee. It's the function that matters.
That's a great point. It's a framework to adapt, not just a template to copy blindly. Okay, let's think about information flows and items, another component. How does information factor into managing the framework itself?
Well, this component highlights the vital inputs needed by the APO01 process and the key outputs it generates. We actually touched on some of these when discussing the practices.
Like the governance principles coming in.
Exactly. For example, those enterprise governance guiding principles and the decision-making model coming down from the governance domain are crucial inputs for designing the management system. APO01.01.
Okay. And outputs. What does APO1 produce that's important for other parts of the framework?
Well, the definition of organizational structure and functions from APO 1.04 and the definition of INT-related roles and responsibilities from APO 1.05 are really key outputs.
Because other processes need to know who does what.
Think about it. The structure and roles defined here become inputs for many other processes down the line. For instance, knowing who owns data from APO 1.07 is absolutely essential for security services, maybe like DSS-05. Knowing the structures is relevant for enterprise architecture, which we'll get to in APO 03.
Oh, okay.
It shows how defining the framework in APO 01 creates this foundational layer of information that gets used throughout INT management.
It really shows how interconnected the framework is, doesn't it? Everything relies on these basics being defined first. Okay, another component. Principles, policies, and procedures.
Yes, component E. This describes the rules that guide behavior and processes. The source mentions a governance policy as a relevant example here for APO 01.
And the description of that policy in the source, I remember seeing, it's quite detailed. It covers principles like INT governance being critical, the need for strategic alignment, prioritizing based on business value, continuous improvement, and the importance of tailoring the framework.
Right.
This ties directly back to that APO 1.09 practice of defining and communicating policies, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Having these policies documented and communicated is essential for the framework to function consistently. The source also lists things like a program project management policy under this component elsewhere in the document, just reinforcing that idea of documented rules for key activities.
Makes sense. Finally, for APO 01, let's touch on the culture, ethics, and behavior component. Component F. How does something seemingly soft like culture fit into managing the INT framework?
Well, the source points out that the effectiveness of the framework isn't just about having documents. It's about how people actually act,
Yeah.
how they behave.
Right.
So this component highlights desired cultural elements. It talks about clearly describing user roles and responsibilities around, say, information usage, security, privacy. It emphasizes fostering a common culture of expected behaviors and having, importantly, zero tolerance for unethical actions.
That's powerful. It's not enough to just have rules on paper. You need a culture where those rules are understood and followed, where ethical behavior is just the norm. It shows the framework considers the human element, which is critical.
Definitely. The source even references external guidance like NIST SP 853, linking this cultural aspect to broader security best practices.
Interesting connection.
Exactly. So to sort of wrap up APO 01, it's that essential first step of defining the rules of the game for INT management, establishing the processes, the structures, the information flows, the policies, and the necessary culture. You really need that foundation before you can build anything else.
Okay, and with that foundation hopefully in place, you can then start planning what INT is actually going to do. Which brings us neatly to APO 02, Manage Strategy.
All right, APO 02 is all about ensuring INT has a clear strategy, and critically, that this strategy is deeply aligned with the overall enterprise strategy. It's defining where INT is headed to best support the business's goals.
So if APO 1 is how we manage INT, then APO 02 is where we are directing INT's efforts. Okay, let's look at the process practices for APO 2. Where does this strategic journey begin according to the source material?
It begins, logically enough, with APO 02.01, understand enterprise context and direction. You simply can't set an effective INT strategy if you don't understand the business's situation, its goals, and the external factors affecting it.
So first look outwards, understand the big picture.
Precisely. This practice involves summarizing the enterprise's context and strategy and then identifying the specific INT implications within that. Inputs are things like the enterprise strategy itself and maybe identifying potential innovation opportunities linked to business drivers. Outputs include that summarized context and the initial results for a gap analysis.
Okay, so you start with the business and identify where INT fits in. What's next?
Next is APO 02.02. Determine current environment performance. Basically, where are we today in terms of INT capabilities? What's the baseline?
Right. This practice assesses the current state. It looks at performance reports, results from maybe SWOT analyses, risk profiles, essentially, evaluating the effectiveness and capabilities of the existing INT landscape. The outputs are a definition of the current environment and, importantly, identification of performance and capability gaps.
Okay, so now you have a handle on the current state and the business direction. The next practice, APO 2.03, is a define target digital capabilities. This is defining the future state. Where do we want to be?
Right. Based on that enterprise direction in the assessment of the current state, this practice articulates the desired future INT capabilities, services, and products.
What does INT need to look like?
Inputs here include the summarized business context, analysis of current services, and maybe new innovation ideas. The output is the definition of the target INT capabilities. The source mentions specific activities like defining high-level INT objectives and ensuring they clearly contribute back to the enterprise objectives.
And that link to enterprise objectives is absolutely critical for alignment, isn't it?
Yeah.
The source even gives example metrics here, like measuring the percentage of enterprise objectives that are actually supported by INT goals, a direct check.
Okay, so you know where you are, current state. You know where you want to be, target capabilities. Now you need to figure out the path to get there. That must be the next practice, APO 02.04, conduct a gap analysis.
You got it. This practice identifies the differences, the gaps, between the current capabilities and the target capabilities. It takes the identified performance gaps and the target definitions as inputs. The output is the analysis of these gaps and the changes needed to close them. What needs to happen?
And all of this work, understanding context, assessing current state, defining the target, analyzing gaps, it all leads to the core practice, right? APO 02.05. Define the strategic plan and roadmap. This sounds like the tangible output of the whole strategy process.
It is. This practice involves developing the actual holistic INT strategy and a detailed roadmap for achieving it. The source emphasizes focusing on transformation, not just incremental change. Inputs include those gap analysis results and, of course, budgetary information. You need to know what resources you have. The outputs are the strategic roadmap itself and a plan for communicating it.
And the source highlights activities like integrating different initiatives into a single coherent strategy that's aligned with the business and detailing the steps in the roadmap, including things like training, adoption plans, etc.
Yeah, making it actionable. And the source suggests metrics here like measuring the level of stakeholder support for the strategy. It's
Okay.
a good one. And fascinatingly, the degree of correspondence between the enterprise strategy and the I&T strategy.
A direct measure of how well you've actually aligned them. That's really interesting.
It is. Finally, the last practice listed for APO Zudo is APO 02.06. Communicate the I&T strategy. Because, well, a brilliant strategy sitting on a shelf is pretty useless if no one knows what it is or why it matters.
But gotta get the word out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This practice is about developing and executing a plan to communicate the strategy and the roadmap effectively. The roadmap is an input, and the communication plan is the output. Activities include actually creating the plan and ensuring you have mechanisms to keep stakeholders informed and hopefully on board.
Now, what really stands out in the source regarding APO Zoo 2, you mentioned alignment goals. It explicitly links this objective to achieving broader enterprise goals, e.g. and alignment goals, hasn't it?
It does, yeah. The framework actually maps which objectives support which goals. It's quite detailed.
Oh, this is where you see the why in action. The source shows APO Zoo 2 as primarily or secondarily supporting a whole range of goals. What are some examples?
Well, on the enterprise side, e.g., it supports things like EG07, realized benefits from I&T-enabled investments and services portfolio, EG08, delivery of I&T services in line with business requirements, EG09, optimization of business process costs, also things related to staff skills, digital transformation, innovation.
Okay, so tangible business outcomes.
That's
What
so.
about the alignment goals, AG?
On the alignment side, it supports goals like AG03, realized benefits from I&T investments, AG05, delivery of I&T services aligned to business requirements, AG06, I&T agility, AG08, use of I&T enabling business processes, also competence of staff, innovation culture. You see the pattern.
Absolutely. So by actively managing your INT strategy following the APO 02 practices, you're not just creating a document, you're directly contributing to achieving these tangible business and INT-related outcomes listed right there in the framework. That's a really powerful connection.
It really shows the strategic importance of this objective. And looking at the information flows and items component for APO 2, you see again how information ties this all together.
Like the enterprise context and direction flowing in to start the process, and the strategic roadmap flowing out as the key result.
Yes, and that strategic roadmap output from APO 02 becomes a critical input for so many other objectives. Not just other APO objectives like, say, APO 07 managing human resources or APO 09 managing suppliers. But crucially for the BAI, build, acquire, implement domain, it feeds directly into how solutions are identified and built.
Right, so the strategy defined here dictates what projects get started, how resources are allocated across different INT activities. It's not an isolated plan, it's the driver for a lot of the rest of the INT management activities.
Exactly. It takes inputs from across the business and risk domains, like EDM of V1, and provides the essential direction for planning and building.
Okay, so we've got the management framework defined, APOs 1, and we've set the strategic direction, APOs 02. What's next in this foundational trio, APOs 03? Managed Enterprise Architecture.
Right, APO 03. This is where you translate that strategic direction from APO 02 into a concrete blueprint. The source-defined enterprise architecture, EA, as the blueprint for the enterprise and its INT enabling strategy execution.
Okay, I like that. Blueprint. So APO 01 is the how we manage, APO 2 is the where we're going strategically, and ATO 3 is the detailed design of what the organization and its INT will actually look like to get there.
That's a perfect summary.
Let's look at the process practices for APO 03 then. How does this blueprinting process begin according to the source?
It starts with APO 03.01, define the enterprise architecture. This practice essentially establishes what EA is for your organization, including its components, relationships, principles, and the guidelines that govern it.
Setting the scope and rules for EA itself.
Exactly. The source says inputs here can be things like requirements, repositories, and confirmed acceptance criteria from stakeholders. And outputs are things like the architecture principles themselves and the architecture requirements. Activities involve things like identifying the business capabilities needed and confirming the core principles that will guide the architecture design.
Okay, principles first, then.
Then, APO 03.02, define the architectural vision. This practice creates a high-level view, a kind of sketch, of the current state architecture, the baseline, and the desired future state, the target.
The big picture view.
Right. Inputs include those architectural requirements, maybe business scenarios, and even information about the organizational structure defined back in APO01. The outputs are the approved architectural vision and initial high-level definitions of the baseline and target architectures. Activities involve understanding the enterprise's strategic goals, connecting back to APO02, and creating this vision based on what stakeholders actually need.
So once you have that high-level vision approved, you need the details, right? That must be APO 03.03, develop baseline and target architectures.
Precisely. This practice dives deep into creating detailed descriptions of the current and desired future states across various architecture domains. The source mentions business, information, application, and technology domains.
Okay, the standard EA domains.
Inputs are the approved vision and those initial baseline target definitions. The outputs are the much more detailed descriptions for each domain. The source mentions refining these details based on specific requirements.
So you have the detailed as's and to be states. How do you get from one to the other?
That leads to APO 3.04, define the sequence plan. This practice defines the roadmap for implementing the target architecture. It might include necessary intermediate steps or transition architectures.
The plan to make the blueprint real.
Exactly. The detailed target architecture descriptions are an input, and the output is an updated architecture document that includes this sequence plan. The source highlights integrating this sequence plan into the broader program and project planning processes. You see the link to the BAI domain again.
Makes sense. It has to connect to actual projects. Is that it for the practices?
One more crucial one, APO 03.05, manage the enterprise architecture. EA isn't a one-time project you do and forget. It's something that needs ongoing management and governance.
Keeping it alive and relevant.
Exactly. This practice is about managing the EA throughout its life cycle and ensuring it's actually used to guide decisions. Inputs include things like acquisition plans, organizational structures, target architectures, and results from compliance reviews.
Compliance reviews. So checking if projects follow the architecture.
Yes. And outputs include guidance for solution development, documenting any necessary exceptions to the architectural standards, and assessment reports on the EA's effectiveness. The source notes activities like ensuring architecture principles actually guide decision-making on an ongoing basis.
So this ongoing management ensures that as new things are built or acquired, they align with the defined blueprint, which itself, remember, is aligned with the strategy from APO02.
That's the goal. That's the thread running through it.
Looking at the information flows and items component for APO03, you really see how this objective acts as a kind of hub for design information, don't you?
You absolutely do. The architecture principles defined here become inputs for many other processes, like guiding the design of solutions in the BAI domain. The approved architectural vision and the detailed baseline and target architecture definitions. These flow into almost every BAI objective.
Like what?
Well, things like BAI-02 Manage Requirements Definition, BAI-03 Manage Solutions Identification and Build, BAI-04 Manage Availability and Capacity, BAI-05 Manage Organizational Change, BAI-08 Manage Knowledge, BAI-09 Manage Assets, BAI-10 Manage Configuration, BAI-11 Manage Projects. They all rely on this architectural blueprint defined in APO03.
Wow, okay. That makes perfect sense. The architecture developed in APO03 is literally the design guide that tells the build, acquire, implement domain what to create and how it should fit together. It translates the strategic direction into concrete design specifications.
Exactly. It's the critical link between strategy, APO02, and execution, BAI, from a design perspective. And importantly, it also takes inputs from other objectives, like those organizational structurals from APO01, because the architecture has to reflect how the organization is actually structured and operates.
It all interconnects. What about the principles, policies, and procedures component for APO03? What does the source mention there?
The source highlights the architectural principles policy. It defines the general principles that will inform all architectural rules and guidelines. And crucially, it states that these principles ensure alignment with enterprise objectives and strategy.
So establishing these principles within APO03 is about creating the fundamental design rules that ensure the architecture supports the strategic goals defined back in APO02. It formalizes the why behind the design choices.
It really does. So yeah, APO3 is the engine that takes the strategy and turns it into a managed, usable blueprint for the entire enterprise and its INT assets.
Okay, wow. We've taken a really detailed look now at APO01 Managed INT Management Framework, APO02 Managed Strategy, and APO03 Managed Enterprise Architecture, pulling out the key practices and components described in the source material. Let's try and connect the dots now and just reinforce how these three objectives in the APO domain work together.
Sure. I mean, you can really think of it as a logical flow, right? APO 01 establishes the foundational rules, the structures, the processes for how INT is managed within the enterprise. It sets up the operating environment, the rules of the game.
The how. Okay.
Then APO 02 leverages that framework to define the strategic direction. Based on the enterprise context, it figures out where INT needs to go, what capabilities are needed, and creates the plan, the roadmap to get there.
The where.
Right. And finally, APO 03 takes that strategic plan from APO CO2 and translates it into a coherent, detailed design or blueprint, the enterprise architecture. It defines what the business and INT capabilities, the systems, the information flows should look like to actually achieve this strategy.
The what. So you define how you'll manage
Yeah.
APO 1, then you define where you're going, APO 2, and then you design what needs to be built or changed to get there, APO 03.
Exactly.
They really are fundamental steps that build upon each other within the planning phase before you even start building anything significant.
Precisely. And they provide the essential inputs for the subsequent domains, particularly BAI, build, acquire, implement.
Yeah.
You really can't effectively build or acquire stuff if you don't have a framework, a strategy, and an architecture to guide you. It would be chaos.
Okay, so bringing this back to you, our listener, why is understanding these specific COBIT objectives, APO 102 or 3, why is it important even if you're not, implementing COBIT religiously chapter and verse?
Well, whether you're trying to understand decisions being made about technology investments in your organization, or maybe grappling with organizational changes in IT, or even just trying to make sense of the structure of a large enterprise's technology function,
Yeah.
understanding these objectives gives you a really powerful mental model.
It helps you see that behind all the complexity, there should ideally be a structured process, right? A defined way of managing, like APO 1, a clear strategy driving direction, APO 02, and a deliberate architecture guiding design, APO 03. It provides a language and a framework for thinking about INT, not just as, servers and code, but as an integral part of the enterprise that needs careful planning and organization.
It gives you a lens, I think, to evaluate how well your own organization, or perhaps when you're studying or working with, is approaching these really fundamental aspects of INT. Are the roles and responsibilities clear? Is the strategy well defined and actually communicated? Is there a coherent design guiding development, or is it just happening?
Right, yeah. And recognizing these foundational pieces, even if they aren't explicitly labeled APO 01, APO 02, and APO 3 in your world, it helps you understand the context and the rationale behind many critical INT activities and decisions.
It just provides a deeper understanding of the building blocks needed for effective INT governance and management within any complex organization. It helps make sense of it all.
So today we've taken a deep dive into the core of the Align, Plan, and Organize domain from your COBIT 2019 source material covering the framework for management itself, APO 01, the process for defining INT strategy, APO 02, and the objective of managing the enterprise architecture, APO 03.
Yeah, we've seen how establishing the how, defining the where, and designing the what are presented as fundamental for effective INT management, according to this framework source.
And how understanding this structured approach can help demystify this sometimes complex and confusing world of enterprise INT.
Absolutely. Now, building on that idea that enterprise architecture translates strategy into design, maybe a thought to leave you with. As you look at the technology landscape and organizations you're familiar with, maybe ask yourself, how much of the current INT architecture, the systems, the data flows, the structure, how much does it truly reflect the current stated business strategy versus how much is the existing, perhaps legacy architecture actually constraining or maybe even dictating what business strategies are realistically possible for the organization right now? Is technology enabling strategy, or is legacy technology holding it back?
That's a great question. Is the architecture following the strategy, or is the strategy having to follow the architecture? Something to ponder as you navigate the interplay between business goals and the technology that's supposed to enable them.
Definitely something to think about.
We'll be back with another deep dive soon.